are listening to Live from Lord North Street, a podcast from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm joined by the IEA's Director General Mark Littlewood and Research Director Jamie White on the 70th birthday of the National Health Service. The pair discuss how, despite all the praise around the NHS the past few weeks, the system is actually an international laggard on many key issues including healthcare outcomes, survival rates, and waiting times. Whilst cash injections may help in the short term, they will prove to be a waste of taxpayers' money if structural change is not made alongside investment. Far from celebrating the NHS this week, policymakers should be considering wholesale reform of the centralized system to improve patient care and save lives. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to our iTunes channel, IEA Conversations. Mark and Jamie, thank you for joining me on the NHS's 70th birthday. It's been a long 70 years, and it looks like the government believes that the NHS will be here for 70 years more. It has invested now £20 billion extra a year into the National Health Service. It claims it's going to do this through a Brexit dividend. That's possible, but it does not yet exist. It seems to be universally accepted that this will come from tax increases and public borrowing. Over the course of this week, hearing about the 70th celebrations, there's been lots of talk of cake and cheers and very little talk of reform. Doesn't seem like that is on the agenda. So tomorrow, we'll be cleaning up the confetti. The birthday will be over. What's next for the NHS? Mark?
Well, it's not going to last another 70 years, is it? Not in its present form. I guess it might be the case that the healthcare system of the United Kingdom is always called the NHS. But the structure of it is not going to last. We are in a deluded fantasy land in which we appear to have collectively, other than perhaps the three of us in this radio studio, have persuaded ourselves that this is the best, the only, the most equitable and just way of providing healthcare, and that its only failings are a lack of resources. And that way madness lies. So it's not sustainable. And like all things that aren't sustainable, it won't be sustained.
Jamie?
I agree with Mark that it won't be sustained because the pressures on it will build and build. And political dissatisfaction, I think, will be one of the results. So let me be more explicit about the pressures. With an aging population and with advances in medical treatment, you'll find that the percentage of spending on healthcare will go up. And I think it would go up even if we didn't have the NHS. It's going up in other countries that don't have the NHS. But the difference is that when you don't have the NHS, consumers get some say in where that spending goes. And you're going to have mounting discontent with an increasing share of your spending, because it comes from you ultimately, it's tax, going into this inefficient health factory, and you don't have the normal control that a consumer has. So I think that it won't be sustained over the next 70 years. I just wish the government could face up to that right now.
So, Jamie, if costs are going to keep increasing, then surely the Prime Minister putting £20 billion extra a year into the NHS was the right move.
Well, it might have been. That's to say, I think that if you had a private system, you would see spending on healthcare increasing. And I think that extra spending will improve the service provided at the NHS. So it's not the amount of spending that I care about. I mean, nobody worries about how much we spend on shoes in Britain. Why? Because it's just the result of a whole lot of individual choices about shoe purchases. The question about how much we should spend on healthcare arises precisely because it's decided centrally by the government. If it weren't decided in that way, it wouldn't be any kind of issue at all.
And that's the problem, Mark, isn't it? The UK has one of the most centralized systems when it comes to healthcare in the world. So how much will this £20 billion extra a year actually achieve?
Well, less than £20 billion worth of value. I can say that with great confidence, probably more than £0 a year of value. So somewhere between £1 and £19 billion worth of value, less than we're pumping in, but some. I mean, almost however dysfunctional a system is, throwing more money at any system, even if highly dysfunctional, helps. I mean, it would be extraordinary if this £20 billion didn't make any difference whatsoever. You'd expect it to make some. But it is definitely fiddling while Rome burns. This is not the underlying problem in the National Health Service, is not its lack of resources. That may be a problem. And to Jamie's point, I mean, it seems to me natural that as countries get richer, they will spend more on healthcare. I mean, a very impoverished society will just about have the wherewithal to feed itself and keep a roof over its head and a fire burning. Probably can't deal with anything but the most rudimentary of medical care. And as you get more and more affluent, there's a limit to the number of pints of milk and loaves of bread and flat screen televisions that you actually need in your house. But there is basically no limit to the amount that you can spend on making yourself healthier or your long-term prospects for a healthy life better. So you would expect, all things equal, I'm completely with Jamie, it should be left to natural processes, the proportion of money you spend, not just the total amount of money you spend, to go up as far as healthcare is concerned as you become a richer society. But the idea that it's a decision made by politicians in Whitehall about what the perfect number is the precise root cause of the problem. So there's not much to celebrate on the NHS's 70th birthday other than it might be coming to the end of its natural life.
So the Institute for Fiscal Studies has actually come out and said that this 3.4% increase, or roughly £20 billion extra a year, is only going to have a marginal effect. It's likely to sustain the system as it is now, but the system as it is now is 18-week waiting times and thousands more patients, specifically struggling from very serious illnesses like cancer, dying a year compared to countries in mainland Europe. Jamie, that's clearly not good value for money. And why is it that we can only discuss money in this conversation all week, all month? All we've heard is about additional funding to the NHS. First, where does that stop? I mean, what funding could the government pump in, taxpayer money, that might get the advocates for the NHS to say, okay, finally, that's enough? And if that number is limitless, surely now we have to start looking at reform.
No, I don't think there is any number that would get people in the NHS advocacy groups to say, oh, that's fine, that's enough, we'll stop there. I mean, their interests are served by always more money going into it. The problem you have when you fund it through taxation is that you don't just spend a higher percentage of your income as a taxpayer on healthcare, which you might choose to do anyway. You are taxed at a higher rate, and that is a different way of raising the money for something than paying it privately, because taxation has a deadweight cost that private purchasers don't have. And so as the amount of money collected in tax to fund the NHS goes up and up and up, it's a greater and greater drag on the economy. And I think that's going to be the natural limit. So the limit's going to come not by the demands from the healthcare sector for more spending stopping. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is that the government literally cannot collect any more tax. What people seem to think that the government can just choose to put up the rate of tax and it will get more money. That isn't true. There's a kind of maximum amount of money that the government can extract from the taxpayers. And if you look around the world, all the Western economies are kind of running at that level. So I suspect that's what will ultimately put the cap on it, not any enlightened decision that really we are now spending enough on healthcare.
And Mark, that's dangerous, isn't it? Because that means that the NHS is already in a state of perpetual crisis. It seems to be completely out of people's minds as they're eating their birthday cake today that back in January, just this year, they had to cancel 50,000 operations in order to make A&E continue to float, to stay alive. The NHS is already in crisis, but to Jamie's point, basically it just has to get worse and worse and worse until there is a breaking point. I mean, how many people are going to get hurt in that process? Literally hurt. We're talking about healthcare. Yeah,
I mean, it is an interesting one, this. I don't know what breaking point is. I mean, Jamie's quite right to say that there is a maximum amount of money that the government can extract in taxation. Theoretically, I suppose it could throw all of that money at the National Health Service, scrap the army, scrap the entire education system, no more transport projects, no more welfare spending, just everything goes to the National Health Service. I mean, you could massively increase the NHS budget if you were willing to go down that path. But you're right to point out that there are a hugely substantial number of lives at stake here by our failure to have a system that runs as efficiently as virtually anywhere in mainland Europe. And so you're talking about, if you're comparing to the best in other fields, but the sort of people we should be able to aspire to match. It's not obvious to me why Belgium should be much better at treating cancer than the United Kingdom. They're not an enormously more affluent country than ours. They're a less efficient country in many ways.
More than 10,000 people's lives could be saved every year based on structure alone.
Just on cancer?
Just on cancer, if they were treated in Belgium instead of on the NHS.
Just on cancer compared to Belgium, I think if you look at stroke rates, your chance of surviving a stroke could be 5,000 fewer deaths a year if we were at sort of Swiss or German standards. So, I mean, it is an absolutely colossal number of deaths, but it's less visible, isn't it? I mean, and the oddity is that people sort of consider death, in hospital to be sort of, well, that's just sort of bad luck, whereas treatment to be the genius intervention of the medical profession. And sometimes it is indeed that. I mean, there are some very talented people who are very good at making you better and keeping you alive, but it's a very weird way to look at it. I was having a Twitter spat with somebody who said, well, I was overlooking the millions of people that the NHS helped. I'm not overlooking that, but it's just not the question. We don't praise the restaurant industry for satisfactorily feeding millions of people every year and accept that the number of people who unnecessarily and avoidably die of food poisoning should just be out-trumped by the fact that there are large numbers of restaurants serving colossal numbers of meals. So the question isn't, does the NHS do some good? I get irritated by Sky News are running this #MyNHS story. And you sort of, whatever, I was involved in a road accident and I was whisked off to A&E and they patched me up and I survived. Yeah, that's the point of the goddamn service. This is not a miracle. This is the raison d'etre of healthcare. And so we just seem to be sort of accepting that, anything other than us all dying instantly is the miracle of the National Health Service. And anything that goes wrong is simply because the evil Conservatives have starved this of resources. And rather like Jamie, I fear there is no limit to this. I don't think I've ever come across a government agency or department anywhere on planet Earth that has turned around to politicians and said, if anything, you're giving us rather too much money. We fear we're wasting it.
You don't see that happening. I like your restaurant analogy. I like one that's slightly more personal. It's not as if you say to your boyfriend or girlfriend, well, I didn't cheat on you, so I deserve all the credit. No, that's the baseline, right? You don't get credit for things like that. Keeping people alive is surely the baseline for any healthcare system. And this is where we see the NHS fail. Even in the one study that puts the NHS at the top, the Commonwealth Fund study, it still ranks the UK 10th out of 11 for patient outcomes. And as The Guardian wrote up in 2014, in this ironically glowing report of the study, it mentioned that the only serious black mark against the NHS was its poor record on keeping people alive. Yep. Something most of us care about when we're going through healthcare. Jamie, I want to speak to you a little bit about this absolute devotion that people have to the UK healthcare service, because I'm from America, and America has a really botched healthcare system. It is extremely expensive. If you can afford it, if you can afford the insurance, you can get some excellent healthcare. It's very innovative in the tech sector, especially. But if you can't afford healthcare, you may very well go without. And the state-run healthcare, Medicaid, is abysmal. I don't know anybody who advocates for the U.S. system, which maybe we'll come back to at the end. But I think what's more notable is that people in America can talk about this. I mean, I can say quite comfortably that we have a healthcare service that's in desperate need of reform. If you speak to anybody really around the world in any developed country, they talk about their healthcare system like it's a service, not like it's a god. You're from New Zealand. You've spent a lot of time in different countries around the world. People think it's really strange, don't they, when they hear British people talk about the NHS?
I find it very strange, yes. New Zealand actually has a very similar system. The only notable difference is that in New Zealand you pay to go to a GP. And that makes a huge difference, actually, a massive improvement in the service you get from GPs, because they're not inundated by people down there who don't really need to be there, because they're paying a little money to go. And this means that the GPs give you a bit more time, their offices are nicer, it's a superior experience. But in other regards, New Zealand more or less has an NHS, but it's not got that name, it's not sacred, people don't go on about our NHS.
Are you allowed during elections to say potentially it needs some improvements?
Yes, you are allowed to say that, although
that's remarkable.
Now I think we get to the essence of the matter. You're not going to get very popular by saying we're going to completely change it so that you buy insurance policies and you pay, you do co-payments and all sorts of things like that. People I think, still want, in New Zealand, they want it not to pay. Now, that's the nice feature of the NHS. You don't pay. You pay through your taxes, but you don't...
you do pay, but it's free at the point of use.
Of course, you don't pay to get the medical treatment. And this feature, which is the sacred feature, is actually the great flaw as well. And interestingly, the United States has the same flaw. Most US policies, health policies, are provided by employers, and they are full cover. That's to say, even when you go to the equivalent of a GP in America, you don't pay. I heard a nice analogy. This is like saying you get insurance on your car that covers you for the regular checkup, the regular servicing, I mean. What effect do you think that would have on the way people behave and the prices charged by the people who do the car servicing and so on? So interestingly, the NHS and America have the same feature, which is that consumers don't face prices. Where consumers do face prices, in places like Singapore, for example, they ration themselves. Right? It's not rationed by the system, it's rationed by the consumers. In Singapore, total spending on healthcare is 4% of GDP. Now, they do have a slight demographic advantage. There's a slightly younger population. But that's not enough to account for this massive difference. And, by the way, they have better outcomes.
They do.
This, I think, gets to the root of the problem. That for those of us who desperately want to see radical reform of healthcare provision in the United Kingdom, it behoves us to genuinely try and understand why it feels like we're pushing water uphill. I don't believe that the British electorate at large are completely irrational, mad people. So why is it so difficult to raise these issues? And I've got two thoughts on that that I think we need to focus on a bit. The first is that healthcare by its nature doesn't easily lend itself to personal comparisons. Most British people would have gone abroad on holiday, for example, and compared foreign cuisine to British cuisine, or foreign service or taxis to British taxis. And very quickly, if they find that what's happening abroad is better, they say, well, why aren't we getting that at home?
Really good example is trains, actually. People
Trains.
keep talking in the debate about nationalization, what's happening in Europe.
So that people will make these comparisons because, in your not quite your day-to-day life, and not everybody's a jet-set international traveller, you are pretty much only receiving healthcare in your own domain. I mean, people will get ill on holiday, but it's unusual. So you don't really have those sort of competitive cross-border checks. You're going to receive healthcare very likely within, a couple of miles of your front door. It wouldn't cross your mind to fly to Zurich or Berlin to go and see a GP, whereas it might very well cross your mind to import a BMW or a Toyota if you want to drive a car. So the comparison point isn't there. That makes it difficult. And the second issue, which I think we've got to be conscious about when we talk about prices and people responding to them, is that not so much perhaps going and seeing your GP because you've got, a verruca on your toe that needs removing, but for critical healthcare issues, it is life-changing and colossally expensive. This isn't like deciding what type of television set you're going to buy or whether you're going to buy yourself a new pair of shoes. You are potentially looking at requiring hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of pounds worth of care in order to have a fair and fighting chance of staying alive. And I think psychologically that impacts people. They can understand, well, I might have to go without a pair of shoes. I might not be able to upgrade my TV set for another few years. But the idea they might suddenly be diagnosed with leukemia and there would be no backstop to them being able to have a fair chance of survival is what I think allows the NHS to perpetuate the view that there is no alternative. It's very difficult for us. Back in the 1960s, when the Institute of Economic Affairs was arguing that it was ridiculous that the British car industry was nationalised, people's instinctive response was, what have you guys got against cars? Why do you hate cars so much? Why are you so down on cars? Cars are great things. Why are you anti-cars? And it's the same now when you actually say, well, I'm deeply sceptical about the NHS. Why don't you want poor people to have healthcare? Is the immediate response. But I think there are those two things, the lack of a comparator and the fact that it is, most people in their lives will come across a life-changing, colossally expensive episode or incident that means there are more psychological barriers to accepting market mechanisms here than there are in our day-to-day lives.
Mark's point that people don't travel to get healthcare, there are some little exceptions to that. One is dentistry. So, for example, in Thailand, they have very good dentists and they're very cheap compared to, let's say, New Zealand dentists. And some people go on holiday to Thailand to get the dentistry. And interestingly, cosmetic surgery is another one. Now, the interesting thing about those services is that they're what you might call the fringe of what people need. So some of this is cosmetic dentistry as well. And this presents the NHS with a challenge as well, because as we get richer and as healthcare technology advances, there'll be more and more treatments, let's call them, that it's not clear, are they medical treatment, are they lifestyle treatment? They're at that kind of border. I mean, for example, fertility treatment, I think, is at that borderline. And what should and shouldn't the NHS supply? Those questions are going to be really hard to answer. When you're poor, you need shelter, food, clothing, so on. And I could guess what you want if you're a poor person. Once you become richer, it's much harder to guess what you're going to want after you've satisfied those basic needs. People's luxury preferences, let's call them, are much more varied than their... So the NHS is a model that worked okay in 1950 when the country was poorer, healthcare was more basic. As we get richer and there are more opportunities, it's just a crazy model. It cannot respond to the preferences of the consumers.
And you get, actually, intriguingly, this arbitrary distinction. Jamie makes the point about what's included and what isn't. I mean, almost without comment, we have in Britain private healthcare provision for your eyes and your teeth. But for every other part of your body is apparently needs to be safeguarded by the National Health Service. Why eyes and teeth are particularly suitable for the private sector, but knee surgery isn't. Knee surgery needs to actually be a state monopoly. Nobody's quite explained. So you get these extraordinary divisions, really, which are cost-saving measures, really. The NHS can't, provide everything. So we'll arbitrarily say eyes and teeth are no longer included. And it wouldn't surprise me if we also say, knees and hips are no longer included either, but, livers and kidneys are. It's going to be extraordinary to see what is kept within the envelope and
Jamie?
isn't within the envelope, and it is almost certainly going to be arbitrary.
Yeah, we've got to get people to see that it's just a way of providing insurance, and it's a way of providing healthcare services, and it's the Soviet way of doing it. There are other ways of doing it, and they would be much, much better. But unfortunately, the welfare state has crowded out insurance from the social sector, you might say. So now people get insurance for their car and for their household goods. But in the past, they would have got health insurance. They would have got unemployment insurance. They did that through friendly societies and so on. Private retirements pensions are a kind of insurance product. And the state has really crowded out the insurance sector from that sphere of life. And I'm afraid that by now, after 70 years, most people can't even imagine this stuff being done privately.
Well,
and yet it was.
That's the thing, isn't it? It feels like a blind spot because people really, extremely intelligent people who know their stuff say things like, if it weren't for the NHS, my mom wouldn't be alive, or if it weren't for the NHS, my daughter wouldn't have been born. The United Kingdom does deserve credit for bringing in this concept of universal access to healthcare, Mark, but they don't seem to realize that every other developed country apart from the United States has adopted that principle without adopting the NHS. And I wonder, we haven't really spoken about the political implications of all this, but I really believe we're going far too easy on the politicians in every party who use the NHS to their electoral advantage to fearmonger around it. It isn't, as you say, Mark, that the British public is irrational. It's that they have been fed a lie, a downright lie for a very long time, that the only two options are the NHS and the USA. And I think, as Jamie points out, a lot of people are fearful that there will be no backstop that the rest of the world has seemed to develop.
Yeah, I think it's even worse than that. In the anecdotes that you were just describing there, Kate, about, if it wasn't for the NHS, my mother wouldn't have survived this operation, or my daughter would have died in childbirth or whatever. You're not really comparing the NHS and the USA there. You are comparing the NHS to a world in which there is no healthcare provision whatsoever.
Yeah, anywhere.
You are comparing the National Health Service to avoid, as if those are the two choices, the NHS or no healthcare provision at all for anyone. And it is true that on that comparison, the National Health Service comes out quite well. It does better than if we had no healthcare provision for anyone. But what a ridiculous comparison point. And I wonder on the breakthrough for this, and Kate, I know you've done a lot of arguing of this in television and radio studios. I think what do we really think the Germans and the Dutch have got so wrong, guys? Answer comes there none from the defence of these people. The US system, and perhaps the US as a brand, is sort of seen as a right-wing, selfish, capitalist, devil-take-the-hindmost kind of country that we don't want to replicate. But it's a bit hard to say that about the Dutch, isn't it, really? Or the Swedes, or even, God help us, the French. So once you actually start putting these things on the table and say, can you explain to me why you would prefer to have the British National Health Service to the Dutch healthcare system? Because I think the Dutch have got it right and we have got it wrong. You actually just meet a sort of a wall of silence, or they dissemble. And I think we just got to keep pushing those buttons. And I think in terms of informing people, again, I saw a poll on Sky News that 51% of people thought that the NHS was better than average European healthcare. This isn't an opinion. They are just wrong on the facts. I mean, that is just factually incorrect. The British people believe something that is just not the case. That's not a question of me doubting their opinions. And we need to turn that round. If 51% of British people knew that the Dutch healthcare system was better, then I think pretty soon we're at the races.
Jamie, do you think that's possible? Do you think public opinion can be swayed, especially as we have seen just this outpouring of love and devotion for a service? I mean, I know a lot of people seem to think when they say the NHS, they're talking about the doctors and nurses. Realistically, they're not. They're talking about a bureaucratic process that's centralized and controlled by Westminster, and yet they're eating cake and celebrating it today. Can this be changed?
I'm not sure if it can be changed, but I really find it deplorable. The media are not here to spread propaganda in favour of particular governmental institutions, nor this is just kind of, I don't know whose work they think they're doing. I thought they were supposed to hold people to account. That's the kind of role they're supposed to play in society, not being cheerleaders for the status quo. And I watch you often on TV talking about this, and it seems to come as a surprise, not only to the politicians you might be in the room with, but to the journalists, that there are alternatives to the NHS that provide universal cover. And they're just not doing their job.
The information is out there. Every study is ranking other European countries and Australia and New Zealand and Hong Kong and Singapore higher than the NHS.
And you get this extraordinary, I'm going to be careful what I say here, but you do get this extraordinary sort of deification of the medical profession. Now, I don't want to denigrate the medical profession. I dare say the National Health Service is, by and large, full of people who care passionately about their fellow man and have taken all sorts of training and are experts in the area and work diligently and expertly to try and do their job. But you would think these people were saints. I mean, I don't remember ever hearing in the House of Commons politicians getting up and praising to the rafters our hard-working sewage workers for the fact that we have clean water, the miracle of clean water coming through our taps. I mean, something that a couple of 100 years ago would have been considered an absolute miracle. These people are not praised to high heaven, and nobody's really shown me any evidence that the people in the NHS are particularly harder working than anybody else in any service field. So I don't want to denigrate the medical professional people who go into it, and I would also readily accept that altruism could well be a motive for going into those sort of professions. But it is completely out of kilter with reality to hold these people up to a level of sainthood that we don't seem to ascribe to other vital services in the UK that we expect as of right, such as clean water. We would go ballistic if we did not receive clean water through our taps, but we don't cut a cake every day to celebrate the opening of a sanitation plant.
Last question, Jamie and Mark, I want to know, how are you celebrating the NHS's birthday today?
Well, I'm going to go to the pub and down as many glasses of wine as I can before I need to be sent into an NHS treatment, because I don't trust the buggers to sort me out.
Our Director of Lifestyle Economics will be thrilled to hear that. Mark?
Well, I won't be celebrating it because it so happens that that this birthday falls at a crucial stage in the development of the World Cup football finals. And as I've been spending a huge amount of my time in pubs and bars, drinking, watching football, and intend to do so for the closing stages of the tournament, I'll be taking this birthday as a day off.
Thank you both very much.
For more blogs, podcasts, films, and reports, visit our website, iea.org.uk.